January 17th, 1944. Korsun-Cherkasy Pocket, Ukraine. Through the smoke and ice fog of a frozen dawn, Soviet observers reported something impossible moving through the German lines. It wasn't the silhouette of a panther or tiger. It wasn't the low profile of a Stu-G3 assault gun. It was something that shouldn't exist. A steel monster welded together from the corpses of dead tanks, bristling with weapons that had no business being mounted on a single chassis. Lieutenant Pyotr Volkov pressed field glasses to his face with trembling hands. The cold wasn't making him shake. Through the magnified view, he could see what appeared to be a KV-1 heavy tank hull, but the turret was wrong. The armor was wrong. Extra plates had been welded at impossible angles. A second gun protruded from a makeshift sponson on the right side, and atop the turret, where the commander's cupola should have been, sat what looked like a naval anti-aircraft mount, stripped from a river gunboat. "Comrade Lieutenant," his radio man whispered, voice tight with something between awe and fear, "the Germans are falling back from it." They were. Through gaps in the smoke, Volkov watched Wehrmacht infantry scrambling away from the approaching hybrid as it ground forward at walking pace. Its engine note was wrong, too, a deep, laboring roar that sounded like two diesel hearts beating out of sync. The thing that disturbed Volkov most wasn't the machine itself. It was that he recognized it. 3 weeks ago, that KV-1 had been a burned-out wreck in no man's land, penetrated by German 88mm fire and abandoned as unsalvageable. Someone had gone into that killing ground, dragged pieces back under cover of darkness, and rebuilt the dead into something new. Someone insane, or brilliant, or both. The mad mechanic who created this battlefield monster had a name, though few who served with him would remember it after the war. Senior Sergeant Viktor Dmitrievich Markin had been a tank recovery specialist with the 5th Guards Tank Army, a man whose official duty was salvaging damaged vehicles and stripping them for parts. His unofficial reputation was something else entirely, a necromancer of steel, who saw possibilities in wreckage that engineering manuals said couldn't exist. Before the war, Markin had been a machinist at the Kirov plant in Leningrad, one of thousands who built the KV series heavy tanks. He understood these machines the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He knew which welds could be cut and reformed, which components could be swapped between different models, which official specifications were conservative estimates that could be exceeded with proper technique and complete disregard for peacetime safety margins. The Eastern Front had transformed him from machinist to improviser. The Soviet tank forces had learned brutal lessons in 1941 and 1942. German anti-tank weapons, particularly the 88mm flak gun adapted for ground use, could penetrate Soviet armor at ranges that made conventional engagements suicidal. Tank crews developed a grim saying, "The Germans kill us from kilometers away. We die before we can even shoot back." By January 1944, the Soviet advance had created a strange new problem. The Red Army was overrunning battlefields littered with destroyed tanks, both Soviet and German. Enormous graveyards of steel where burned-out T-34s lay beside gutted Panthers, where KV-1s with blown turrets sat frozen in the mud next to disabled Tigers. Recovery teams worked around the clock, but they followed rigid protocols. Tanks damaged beyond a certain threshold were stripped for parts and left where they lay. The engineering manuals were clear. Some damage couldn't be repaired in field conditions. Markin had begun to question those manuals in December 1943. His unit had established a forward recovery position in the ruins of a collective farm 6 kilometers behind the front lines. The site was chosen for its intact barn, one of the few remaining structures with a roof, and its access to a dirt road that could accommodate tank transporters. Over the course of 2 weeks, his crews had dragged back 17 destroyed Soviet tanks from the Korsun battlefield. Most were routine salvage, engines pulled and sent to rear workshops, transmissions catalogued, armor plates cut free to be welded onto damaged but repairable vehicles. But 3 of the wrecks were KV-1 heavy tanks, and something about them had caught Markin's attention. Each had been killed differently. One had taken an 88mm round through the turret ring, jamming the turret but leaving the hull intact. Another had suffered engine fire but retained a functional turret and gun. The third had been penetrated in the driver's compartment, but its drivetrain was undamaged. Lieutenant Anatoly Gordeyev, the political officer assigned to the recovery unit, found Markin in the barn on Christmas Eve. The sergeant was standing among the 3 wrecked KV-1s, a bottle of vodka in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. He was taking measurements and scribbling notes by the light of a kerosene lamp. "Comrade Sergeant," Gordeyev said carefully. The political officer had learned to approach Markin with caution. The man was invaluable but strange, prone to muttering to himself and working through the night on projects he wouldn't explain. "The quartermaster is asking about parts inventory. We need numbers for the monthly report." Markin didn't look up. 3 KV-1s, 17 T-34s, 1 captured Panzer IV, all stripped and processed according to regulations. The regulations say destroyed tanks should be documented, and the regulations were written by men who never had to watch crews burn alive because our armor can't match German guns, Markin interrupted. His voice was flat, matter of fact. The regulations say these 3 KV-1s are scrap, but together they're not scrap. Together, they're something the regulations never imagined. Gordeyev stepped closer, studying the hulks. "What do you mean, together?" Markin pointed at each wreck in turn. "This one has a good hull and drivetrain. This one has a functional turret and gun. This one has intact armor on the glacis plate and sides. And over there—" He gestured toward a tarp-covered shape in the corner. "That's a burned-out T-34 with a perfectly good transmission. And next to it, plates we cut from a destroyed Panzer III. "You want to combine them," Gordeyev said slowly. "Build one tank from multiple wrecks. Not one tank, one weapon, something that can take punishment and keep fighting, something that gives our crews a chance." Markin took a drink from the bottle, wiped his mouth. "I need 3 weeks. I need my best welder. I need you to keep the commissariat from asking too many questions." The political officer should have reported this immediately. Unauthorized modifications to military equipment violated numerous regulations. But Gordeyev had seen too many funerals, too many letters written to families explaining that their sons or husbands had died in tanks that were death traps against German guns. He studied Markin's face, the hollowed eyes, the burns on his hands from welding, the absolute certainty of a man who had calculated every angle. 3 weeks, Gordeyev said. "After that, if you haven't created something useful, I report it as salvage operations. Understood?" "Understood." What Markin built over the next 21 days would never appear in any official records. The Soviet military bureaucracy, already strained by total war, maintained only the loosest oversight of forward recovery units. As long as parts continued flowing to the rear and monthly reports showed appropriate salvage numbers, field operations were largely autonomous. This administrative neglect created a space where innovation and desperation could merge. The foundation was the KV-1 hull with the intact drivetrain. Markin and his team, 3 experienced welders and 2 mechanics, spent the first week stripping everything that wasn't structurally essential. The original turret, damaged beyond repair, was removed entirely. The engine compartment was gutted and reconfigured to accept not 1, but 2 diesel engines. The second engine came from a destroyed T-34, smaller than the KV's standard power plant, but still functional. Markin's radical solution was to mount both engines side by side, connecting them through a modified transmission housing that he fabricated from parts of 3 different vehicles. The engineering was crude but effective. Each engine drove 1 track, allowing independent control that gave the hybrid tank unprecedented maneuverability for its weight class. The system sacrificed efficiency. Fuel consumption would be catastrophic, but it solved the KV-1's notorious problem of being underpowered for its mass. With 2 engines producing a combined 1,200 horsepower, the hybrid could match German tanks for acceleration while maintaining the KV's intimidating armor protection. The turret installation required even more improvisation. The functional KV-1 turret from the second wreck was too damaged at the mounting ring to be installed normally. Markin's solution was to weld it directly to the hull in a fixed position, eliminating turret traverse entirely. To compensate, he mounted the entire assembly on a manually operated pivot system that allowed the turret to rotate slowly, about 1 degree per second, using a hand crank operated by the loader. It was primitive, but it worked. But Markin wasn't finished. The hybrid's armament became a bizarre collection of weapons that shouldn't coexist on a single platform. The main gun was the KV's standard 76.2mm ZIS-5, a powerful weapon that could penetrate most German armor at medium range. To this, Markin added a secondary 45mm anti-tank gun stripped from a destroyed T-70 light tank. This smaller weapon was mounted in a sponson welded to the right side of the hull, aimed and fired by the bow gunner through a makeshift sight that Markin fashioned from a captured German rangefinder. The defensive armament was even more audacious. From a wrecked river gunboat being cannibalized at a supply depot 15 kilometers away, Markin's team acquired a 37mm automatic anti-aircraft gun. They mounted it on the turret roof in place of the commander's cupola, creating a position where a crew member could engage aircraft or ground targets with devastating rapid fire. The gun had a rate of 160 rounds per minute and could shred infantry positions or light vehicles. The armor protection was perhaps the most visible evidence of Markin's unconventional approach. He had scavenged armor plates from every destroyed tank within reach, Soviet, German, even captured French equipment. These were welded onto the hull in overlapping layers that created a chaotic patchwork appearance. Additional plates were angled steeply on the front glasses, creating what amounted to improvised sloped armor that dramatically increased effective thickness. The final result looked like a steel creature that had grown armor scales, each plate a different thickness and quality of steel. Lieutenant Gordeyev watched the transformation with growing unease. By the end of the second week, the thing in the barn no longer resembled any tank in service. It was taller than a standard KV-1, the added armor and weapons giving it an aggressive, predatory profile. The welding was rough but solid. Markin had personally inspected every seam, grinding down imperfections and reinforcing stress points. The paint was a mottled combination of winter camouflage white over Soviet green, applied hastily with whatever was available. On January 12, 1944, 5 days before the hybrid would first enter combat, Markin attempted to start both engines simultaneously. The test attracted a crowd of curious soldiers and recovery personnel. When the diesels caught and roared to life, the sound was unlike anything they'd heard. Two engines running slightly out of sync created a distinctive pulsing growl that seemed to make the frozen ground vibrate. Black smoke poured from twin exhausts. The hybrid tank lurched forward on its tracks, slewing slightly as Markin adjusted to the independent drive system, then straightened and accelerated with surprising speed for something weighing over 50 tons. Gordeev approached Markin when the test concluded. The sergeant was covered in grease and diesel fuel, grinning with an expression somewhere between triumph and madness. "It needs a name," the political officer said. Markin wiped his hands on a rag, considering. Frankenstein, like the book, something built from dead things that shouldn't be alive. "That's a foreign name. The commissariat won't approve. Then they can call it whatever they want in the reports. But this," Markin patted the hull with genuine affection, "this is Frankenstein, and tomorrow we find out if it can fight." The opportunity came sooner than expected. On January 15th, German forces launched a counterattack aimed at relieving their encircled troops in the Korsun pocket. The Soviet lines holding the western approaches were thin, stretched across frozen fields and ruined villages. Intelligence reported Tiger tanks supporting the German thrust, heavy breakthrough weapons that had terrified Soviet crews since their introduction at Leningrad in 1942. The local Soviet commander, Major Grigory Volkov, received Markin's request personally. The sergeant wanted permission to take the hybrid into combat. "It's ready," Markin insisted. "It's not perfect, but it's ready. And you need everything you can put on that line." Volkov was skeptical. The hybrid had no official designation, no test results, no approval from higher command. But he was also desperate. His tank units had suffered 40% losses in the previous week. Replacement vehicles were en route, but wouldn't arrive for days. He looked at the mongrel steel creature sitting in front of the barn, its mismatched armor plates and improvised weapons giving it an almost alien appearance. "You'll be the commander?" Volkov asked. "I built it. I'll crew it." "You're a recovery specialist, not a tank commander." "I was a machinist before the war," Markin replied. "None of us are what we were. We're what the war made us." Volkov assigned Markin a crew of volunteers, experienced tankers from destroyed units who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Private Alexei Sokolov, a driver who'd survived the destruction of 3 T-34s, took the driver's position. Sergeant Boris Kuznetsov, a gunner whose tank had been penetrated at Kursk, manned the main 76.2 millimeter gun. Corporal Ivan Petrov, bow gunner and mechanic, operated the secondary 45 millimeter weapon. And Corporal Mikhail Volkov, the major's younger brother, volunteered for the exposed position manning the turret-mounted anti-aircraft gun. On the morning of January 17th, Frankenstein rolled into combat positions alongside a depleted company of T-34 tanks. The Soviet defensive line occupied a low ridge overlooking open farmland that stretched for 2 kilometers toward German-held territory. Through the pre-dawn darkness, they could hear the rumble of approaching engines. A lot of engines. The German attack began at 0630 hours with an artillery barrage that shook the frozen earth. Then, through the smoke and snow, came the tanks. 3 Tigers leading, with Panzer IVs and infantry in support. The Tigers were the nightmare, 56-ton monsters with 88 millimeter guns that could kill any Soviet tank at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Soviet doctrine called for coordinating multiple T-34s to flank Tigers, accepting losses to achieve kill shots on the thinner side armor. It was arithmetic written in blood. Markin waited. The hybrid tank sat hull down behind the ridge crest, only its patchwork turret visible. He watched through a captured German periscope as the Tigers approached, arrogant in their supremacy. At 1,800 meters, they began firing at the T-34 positions. One Soviet tank exploded immediately, its turret blown 20 meters from the hull. Another took a hit that penetrated the driver's compartment. The crew didn't survive. "Sokolov," Markin said calmly into the intercom. "Advance to firing position. Slow. Make them think we're just another T-34. Frankenstein crested the ridge, and for a moment the battlefield seemed to pause. The hybrid's appearance was so unexpected that German observers weren't sure what they were seeing. The patchwork armor, the oversized profile, the multiple gun barrels protruding at different angles. It looked like some medieval war machine that had been transplanted into the 20th century. The lead Tiger commander made his assessment quickly. He saw a Soviet heavy tank exposing itself, and he took the shot. The 88mm round struck Frankenstein's front glasses at a range of 1,400 meters, impacting one of the angled armor plates that Markin had welded at 60 degrees. The penetrator hit the plate, skidded upward along the slope, and deflected over the turret. The sound inside the tank was like being inside a bell struck by a hammer. "We're alive," Sokolov reported, voice shaking. "We're hit, but we're alive." "Kuznetsov," Markin ordered. "Main gun, lead Tiger, aim for the glacis joint." The hybrid's turret began its slow rotation, the manual crank system moving the entire assembly degree by degree. It was agonizingly slow compared to powered traverse, but Markin had calculated this. At long range, the target wasn't moving fast enough to matter. Kuznetsov had time. The 76.2mm gun fired at 1,350 meters, the round striking the Tiger's frontal armor at the weld line between upper and lower glacis plates. The penetration wasn't perfect. The Tiger's armor was too thick for a clean kill, but the round caused internal spalling that wounded the driver and jammed the transmission. The crippled Tiger slewed to a stop, and the other German tanks suddenly had a problem. This Soviet tank had taken an 88mm hit and survived. It had returned fire and damaged a Tiger. It was something they couldn't immediately understand, and in armored warfare, confusion is often fatal. Frankenstein's secondary weapons opened fire. Petrov in the bow used the 45mm gun to engage the Panzer IVs following the Tigers, his smaller, faster-firing weapon finding targets at medium range. On the turret roof, Mikhail Volkov opened up with the 37mm anti-aircraft gun, walking streams of explosive rounds across German infantry positions. The rapid-fire weapon was devastating against unarmored targets, turning infantry formations into chaos. The battle devolved into a savage close-range exchange. Two more Tigers attempted to flank the hybrid, moving to engage its thinner side armor. But Markin had anticipated this. He ordered Sokolov to rotate the entire tank, rather than relying on turret traverse, using the independent track drive system to pivot Frankenstein and keep its heavily armored front facing the threat. The dual-engine configuration made the maneuver possible. A conventional KV-1 would have been too slow. At 800 meters, Kuznetsov fired again. This round struck a Tiger's turret ring, the junction between hull and turret where armor was thinner. The penetration was catastrophic. The Tiger's internal ammunition exploded, blowing the turret completely off the hull in a fireball visible across the battlefield. The destruction of a Tiger by a Soviet tank at ranges where the German vehicle should have dominated sent shockwaves through the German formation. The attacking force hesitated. Then, gradually, it withdrew. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized preserving valuable heavy tanks over achieving objectives at any cost. 2 Tigers damaged or destroyed for uncertain gains wasn't acceptable mathematics. As German forces pulled back, Soviet troops along the line began shouting. Some were cheering. Others were simply staring at the hybrid tank that had somehow survived against weapons that should have destroyed it. Frankenstein had taken 17 hits during the engagement. 11 were from machine guns and small arms, irrelevant against armor. 4 were from 75mm Panzer IV guns. These had penetrated the thinner side armor plates, but failed to cause critical damage due to the overlapping layer arrangement that dissipated energy. 2 were from 88mm Tiger guns. 1 had deflected off the angled front armor. The other had punched through a side plate, killing Corporal Petrov instantly and wounding Kuznetsov in the leg. But the hybrid remained operational. Both engines still functioned. The main gun could fire. The tracks moved. Major Volkov found Markin supervising repairs that afternoon. The sergeant was welding fresh armor plates over the penetration holes, using metal scavenged from destroyed German tanks. His hands moved with the practiced precision of a man who had spent months patching holes in dying machines. "Senior Sergeant Markin," Volkov said formally, "I'm recommending you for the Order of the Red Star. Your tank destroyed 1 Tiger and damaged another. More importantly, you held a critical position when the line was about to break." Markin shut off the welding torch and raised his protective mask. "With respect, Comrade Major, don't recommend me for anything. Frankenstein isn't supposed to exist. The moment higher command learns what I built, they'll either take it away for study or order it destroyed as unauthorized modification of state property. Let me keep working. That's all I want." Volkov understood. The Soviet military system was simultaneously brutal and pragmatic. Innovation was encouraged in theory, but tightly controlled in practice. Individual initiative that produced results was tolerated at the front, but the bureaucracy in the rear had different priorities. He nodded slowly. "Then this engagement never happened. We destroyed the Tigers with T-34s and anti-tank guns. Understood?" "Understood." Frankenstein fought in 12 more engagements over the next 6 weeks. Each battle added modifications. Markin installed smoke grenade launchers salvaged from a German half-track. He added camouflage netting and mounting points for spare track links and armor plates. The interior became more refined as the crew learned to work in the cramped, unconventional space. Sokolov mastered the dual-engine control system, developing techniques for making the hybrid tank pivot and maneuver with unexpected agility. Kuznetsov adapted to the slow turret traverse, learning to anticipate target movement and make shots that conventional gunners would never attempt. The kill count was impressive. 7 confirmed German tanks destroyed, including 3 Tigers, 11 armored vehicles damaged or disabled, uncounted infantry casualties from the devastating effect of the turret-mounted anti-aircraft gun against ground targets. But the real achievement was psychological. German intelligence reports from the Korsun sector began mentioning an unusual Soviet tank with mismatched armor and multiple weapons. Some reports called it a command tank. Others suggested it was an experimental prototype. None correctly identified it as field improvisation by a single mechanic. The end came on February 28, 1944, during the final collapse of the German pocket. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, and Frankenstein was assigned to pursue retreating Wehrmacht units. The hybrid was crossing a wooden bridge over a swollen river when German engineers, covering the retreat, detonated demolition charges they'd placed days earlier. The bridge collapsed. Frankenstein, weighing over 50 tons with all its additional armor, plunged through the wooden structure and into the icy water. The crew survived. They abandoned the sinking tank and swam to shore through water so cold it nearly stopped their hearts. But the hybrid tank was gone, sinking into river mud that would hold it for decades. Markin stood on the riverbank, watching the last bubbles rise from where Frankenstein had disappeared. He was soaked, freezing, and had lost the machine that had consumed 5 months of his life. Kuznetsov, limping on his wounded leg, joined him. "We can salvage it," the gunner said. "Bring in recovery equipment, pull it out, rebuild it again." Markin shook his head. "No, it did what I built it to do. It kept us alive. It killed Germans. And now it's gone." He turned away from the river. "Come on. There's more wrecks out there. More work to do." Senior Sergeant Viktor Dmitrievich Markin survived the war. He returned to Leningrad in 1945, resumed work at the Kirov plant, and never spoke publicly about Frankenstein. The hybrid tank's existence was never officially acknowledged. No photographs survive. The only documentation is scattered references in German intelligence reports and oral histories collected decades later from Soviet veterans who served in the Korsun sector. In 1979, during construction of a new bridge, construction crews discovered a tank hull in the river mud. It was a KV-1 chassis with extensive non-standard modifications, extra armor plates, dual engine mounts, and welding that suggested field fabrication rather than factory production. Soviet authorities examined it briefly, then reburied it. The explanation was simple: wartime salvage. Nothing unusual, nothing that required investigation. But veterans of the Korsun battles knew better. The story of Frankenstein had passed into legend among those who served there, a tale told in the same breath as other Eastern Front myths. The ghost tank built from dead steel, the mad mechanic who turned wreckage into a weapon, the machine that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The truth lies somewhere between documented fact and battlefield folklore. What's certain is that improvised tank modifications were common throughout the war. Crews added extra armor, repositioned weapons, and made unauthorized changes that helped them survive. Markin's achievement, if it existed as described, was simply the most extreme example of a widespread practice. The hybrid tank concept itself would resurface in later Soviet designs. Post-war heavy tanks incorporated lessons learned from field modifications, redundant systems, multiple weapon mounts, and armor schemes that prioritized survivability over mobility. Whether any of these lessons came directly from Markin's creation is impossible to determine. The paper trail doesn't exist. In 1987, a Russian historian researching wartime recovery operations found a single document in military archives. It was a supply requisition from January 1944, signed by Senior Sergeant V.D. Markin, requesting an unusual list of parts: 2 complete diesel engines, armor plates of various specifications, gun mounts from 3 different vehicle types, and welding supplies sufficient for a month of continuous work. The requisition was approved without question. In wartime, nobody asked why a recovery specialist needed so much material. They assumed he knew what he was doing. Perhaps he did. Perhaps somewhere in the mud of a Ukrainian river lies the evidence of what one man could build when desperation met skill. A tank that never officially existed, crewed by men whose names appear in no award citations, fighting battles that were credited to other units. Frankenstein remains what it always was: a ghost of steel, a legend whispered among those who knew that sometimes, on the Eastern Front, the line between madness and genius disappeared entirely. The mad mechanic turned wreckage into a weapon, and for 3 months that weapon kept men alive.